everyone, it's me, Butterfly Spirit 314. So, in today's video, I want to talk about why we have this situation where we may try to come to somebody and talk to them sometimes about whatever, and we just can't get through to other people. And we may spend a long time like wondering, like, why? Like, why is it when I talk to a specific person, like, I never get through to them? And what prompted me to think about this in this book I'm reading, The Lost Art of Listening, I was in chapter 8, and they had some words in here about people, and they were trying to have conversations with people, but they just kept having the same result. And I can speak to this personally because I remember having conversations with a prior boyfriend where basically I would, me and him would have a conversation. That conversation would go from uh, basically a calm conversation, and then it might escalate to a more heated, or if I was upset, it may. It may, go from 0 to 10 already because I was already like emotionally upset. And the reason being was because, like, if I started off as heated, it's probably because I didn't really um, go into the conversation with a goal of what I really wanted, or it was because I was letting my emotions kind of take over and I was just kind of, just saying what I wanted to say without really hearing. And I would repeatedly have the same circumstance where it would be where once that conversation ended, it didn't do anything but like cause damage, if I was involved in a heated conversation with him. So I think this speaks volumes to me that, it makes sense why we may have conversations and they never really go anywhere. We don't really get what we want out of a conversation or whatnot. And there's different reasons why. So, one of the reasons why we keep having the same result with somebody, we never seem to get through to them, in myself personally. One reason is because we keep doing the same thing over and over and over again. And the thing is, we don't realize that we have a pattern for how we conversate with people. And that when we talk to certain people, we get used to doing the same things. We may start the conversations the same way, like by saying the same things like, we need to talk. Or, we may, be in the same room, or we may find ourselves just like, you know, starting the conversation and looking for all the wrong somebody is doing or whatnot. I'm guilty of all this. So, you know, there are patterns to how we communicate with certain people. And we don't communicate with people the same way in our lives, right? So when I'm at work, I'm a lot more formal at work with people. I'm not very close with people really at work. Now, since I've been listening to people a lot more at work, I've come to start, the more like I listen to them in conversations, the more I'm kind of deepening those conversations so that when I have, new conversations with them, I can ask them about something me and that person talked about in a prior conversation that I learned about them, to check up on them. Like, for example, I had a coworker that was talking to me about the fact that he was having trouble with fruit flies in his house. And I was like, oh, hey, I had that same experience. But I only started talking to him about like giving him advice after fully listening through what he was going through. He was talking to me about like how, he had went on vacation. He didn't have a lot of food in his house, but he couldn't seem to figure out where these fruit flies were coming from. They just kind of were coming from nowhere. So after I fully got his point of view of like what was going on, then, I said, well, I gave my input and said, well, hey, I know how you feel. I had experiences with fruit flies, and, I found out that fruit flies were coming from the drain in the kitchen sink. And he was like, oh, they live in the sink. I'm like, yeah. I'm like, that's where I found them to be most of the time. They'll be like in the drains and they'll come up out of the drains and be flying around and all that. So I, followed up with my coworker, um, and I think it was yesterday. And he told me that I asked him, how's the fruit flies? How's everything go with that? He's like, oh, turns out the fruit fly traps that he was using and stuff that somebody else suggested to him were working. And I told him, like, awesome, I'm glad to hear that. And I was able to connect with him in that way of like following up with him, letting him know, hey, how was everything going and stuff, just to like show like, care and things like that. So, that can help, when it comes to conversations, right? When we, listen to other people and then give insight, but only after fully listening to what they're saying. Because sometimes people talk to us and they don't want advice, they're just telling us about a situation. So, kind of getting back to why it is that we keep having the same results in conversations, whether they be heated or not, or we repeat the same patterns with people in our lives. Like the things we'll say to, one person is different than another. Like with work, I said I was more formal, but like I said, I was, getting more connected with people and showing interest in conversations with them. Now, when it comes to like family, my family personally, like how I communicate with my siblings is going to be different, versus how I communicate with people at work. We all communicate differently. There's things we will share with some people that we won't share with other people, because we've learned that, as we've grown up, we've kind of learned like who we can trust and who we can't. Okay. So we have a pattern for how we conversate with people. And sometimes when we get in conversations and we're talking to people, specific with a specific person, we might find a situation where like we have a conversation that evolves into an argument. Sometimes what happens is we make the same mistake over and over and over again, and we don't even realize we're doing it. And then by the time we get to the end of the conversation, of talking to this person, we're like, why do I always have the same problem? Something I discovered when it came to my prior boyfriend is that, I realized, I had to realize like, hey, these conversations will happen. Why is this happening or whatever? But I think it's kind of better late than ever, because I kind of started to discover things after, we broke up or whatever. But I think one of the things is that sometimes it is how you start a conversation. And sometimes it's when you start a conversation. I may start a conversation with him like after he gets back from, spending time with family or something, and that, he may be happy. And then, I just may be like, okay, this is the perfect time because it's a weekend or whatever, like, so timing and the conversations were great. Another thing that I realized too, with respect to conversations that I might have been doing that I realized, and I newly realized, is that there's a such thing as conversational styles. So he and and I'm still like working on figuring out like these conversation styles, but like he and I communicate differently. And there was this situation where he and I were having a disagreement. And it was a situation pretty much where, he was communicating in one way, I was communicating in another, and we all communicate in our own unique way. Okay. So, how we perceive ourselves to be communicating or whatever makes sense to us, but to another person, it may not make sense, and an example could be that, maybe in a disagreement, I may find it comfortable to raise my voice, but for him, it's completely uncomfortable and that doesn't make any sense. He may feel like it makes sense to, we could disagree, but maybe not with raised voices or whatever. You know what I'm saying? So when each of us, like, people in general, when each of us communicates, we communicate in a way that's comfortable to us. Okay. And when we conversate, like with people, sometimes there's things that we're okay with that another person isn't okay with. And sometimes it's about recognizing that, hey, maybe this other person isn't okay with that. For some reason, like for another person, if a voice is raised, maybe it could trigger them in some way. But sometimes when we're in argument or something, we may not know that because our emotions are raised. We're focused on how pissed off we are, not on, how am I affecting this other person? And the way to not have the same result in the conversation with the person is, one, to think about, like, how do conversations go? Who initiates the conversation? Are you always the person that initiate a conversation? For me, I was pretty much the person that initiated, arguments, because I would be pissed, But it doesn't mean that every conversation was an argument. It just means that, the same kind of ingredients were there, and I was following kind of the same pattern, in conversations, right? But I think it's about, like, trying to change that dynamic. When we find ourselves in this damn repeated, pattern, when we get in into a conversation with someone. And understand, the more exposure we have to somebody, there's going to be things that, if we have a disagreement with them, we may get triggered by this person. Sometimes in that conversation, sometimes a person may say something to us, and that person may be saying something that triggers us, that reminds us of, something we went through in our childhood, or something that somebody said in our childhood that may trigger us. And then we may just react to that person. And it may not be we're reacting to them. It could be that triggered memory evokes in us those old feelings of something that somebody said when we were a kid. Like if somebody criticized us, or somebody embarrassed us, or somebody made us feel a certain way, and with conversations, that's kind of the tricky part, because once somebody is triggered, they put that wall up, then of course you can't really get through to them, and I think it's about, like, really figuring out, like, why do conversations go that same way, and sometimes it's about asking a person, hey, when we have these conversations, I notice it goes the same way. Why do you think this is? And maybe neither of you is going to know why it is, and I will tell you, for the longest time, I didn't have any idea, but, like, I'm starting to kind of realize too that in conversations, I can honestly tell you, I was a bad listener. I'm going to admit it. I was a bad listener. I can own the hell out of that. I was a bad listener. And the reason why was because I was listening for what I wanted to say, to react back when I was angry, rather than fully taking it in and listening to the other person. And I didn't know about listening, that listening is not just about saying what you want to say, and, waiting to hear something and then, saying something to somebody, or focusing on your point of view. But listening is about hearing someone else out. And this is so, 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 so hard, especially when you're angry. It's hard to listen to somebody, but it's also hard because we are not raised to learn how to listen to people. We're not, and we may be closed off to listening to people, especially if we grew up and we were criticized by people, or we were made fun of by people, or we learned to have thick skin when we were a kid, and so now, like, we have this wall up where we don't trust people. You know what I'm saying? So, listening in itself, it's a process, and I'm learning the skill of listening, thanks to this book. Not just this book, but there's a book, How to Win Friends and Influence People, that I'm reading. And there's other things that kind of turned me on to listening, because I was like, well, why in the hell would you listen to somebody? You know what I mean? Like, listening. Well, I've been listening. But we may confuse hearing somebody say something. We may confuse hearing someone say something, like one bit of what they're saying, with understanding the conversation, when we completely miss the message of what a person is saying, because we may not be able to really read between the lines of what somebody is saying, because we're caught up in our emotions, because we're distracted, because everything else, sky is falling and shit. You know what I mean? And so the thing is that listening is a skill. It's something you have to build up to. Just because we hear somebody say something doesn't mean we fully understand them. And in conversations, it's important to kind of check ourselves and say, well, wait a minute. Am I going to this conversation? Is this conversation just about me and what I want to say? Or is this conversation about, mutually explaining information and just going into it, and it be about learning about another person, and not so much about trying to control it or get what you want out of it and disregard the other person. So that's my little take on it. But guys, I got to head out and go to work. But thank you all for watching. And I hope some of the things I said were helpful. Bye.